Did you know that more than 90% of viewers don't subscribe to our channel? If you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We don't run ads on our videos, so we don't earn anything from them. Every subscription, every like, every comment truly means the world to us. Your support keeps our passion alive and motivates us to create more. We'd also love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's start our story. Story number 1. The night started the way it always did for Marcus Hale, with the muted echo of doors clanging shut at the distribution center and the soft metallic groan of a fully loaded trailer shifting its weight. He signed the final clipboard, slid it back to the yawning dock worker, and climbed up into his cab. The cold air bit his face, and his breath fogged the windshield while the engine turned over in a low, steady rumble. It was a winter run, the kind of trip that stitched through 3 states, mostly by way of long, flat highways and a scattering of rural exits. The dispatch sheet was routine. Pick up in the sprawling maze of warehouses outside the city, carry the freight across state lines, reach the distribution hub by mid-morning. He'd done it dozens of times. Marcus liked nights. Nights were clean. Fewer cars, fewer brakes squealing, no sun hanging low in his eyes. He enjoyed the quiet, the straight line of the road, the monotony that made his thoughts stretch out like the lanes in front of him. The cab was his world, soft lit and humming, the dashboard lights glowing a gentle amber. He eased onto the interstate, watching the city lights fall away in the side mirrors. The sky above was a smooth black dome, the stars veiled by a thin winter overcast. The world narrowed until it was just the sound of the engine, the vibration through the steering wheel, and the wash of white lines passing steadily beneath the truck. For the first 100 miles, nothing strange happened at all. The CB crackled with the occasional burst of chatter, other drivers trading road conditions, complaining about the weather, sharing bad coffee reviews of the last truck stop. Marcus kept the volume low, half listening, content to let their voices drift through like distant neighbors' conversations. At some point the chatter thinned. Static took over. The highway pulled away from the last cluster of roadside lights and sank into real darkness. Mile markers slipped past, green signs briefly illuminated in the beams, and then gone again. Snow flurries began, tiny flecks darting like insects across the windshield. The wipers scraped back and forth, leaving brief, clear views of the road that closed up again in a veil of white. Marcus checked his GPS. Straight line. Same as always. He was passing mile 102 when the CB came alive with a whisper. "You still on Route 16? The voice was low, oddly close in the speaker, as if the person were right beside him. Marcus frowned. He reached for the mic, then stopped. His display showed his channel, but nothing else. He was on I-41, hundreds of miles from any road that matched that number. He waited. No call sign, no follow-up, just a faint hiss of static. "Skip," he muttered to himself. Signals bounced sometimes. He'd picked up Mexican radio in the middle of Iowa once. Strange, but not worth thinking about. He turned the squelch slightly, looking for a clearer noise floor, and settled back into his seat. The miles rolled on. By the time he reached the first rest area, his cup holder was empty, and his eyelids were starting to feel heavy. The blue sign announcing the stop loomed out of the dark. Rest area 1 mile. Next services, 47 miles. He debated pushing through but decided against it. There was no rush, and caffeine alone was no match for the slow creep of winter fatigue. The rest area was almost deserted when he pulled in. One other rig slept along the far edge of the lot, its interior lights dark, its engine off. A couple of cars clustered near the building. Sodium vapor lamps cast an orangish haze over the concrete, turning the snow into something flat and dull. Marcus parked, set the brake, and stepped down into the cold. The wind nosed under his jacket. The air had that dry, brittle scent it got right before a serious freeze. Inside the building, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. The vending machines glowed in their nook. Rows of candy and chips lined up like soldiers. A coffee machine hummed, its plastic face promising gourmet brew with a faded sticker. In the tiled restroom, the only sound was the rush of water and the distant crack of pipes shifting in the walls. His footsteps echoed. On his way back out to the lot, Marcus noticed how quiet it was. The highway, just beyond the trees, sounded muffled. like someone had put a glass dome over the world. Even the snow seemed to fall more softly here. He climbed back into the cab, shut the door, and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel, feeling the familiar comfort of being back in his small, contained world. Then he realized the radio was on. He was sure he'd turned everything off when he stopped. The habit was ingrained. Yet a thin thread of sound poured from the CB. A distant, fuzzy whisper, right at the edge of hearing. Not words, exactly more like a breath moving over the microphone. He reached for the power switch, and in that instant, the whisper sharpened into something like speech. "You missed it again." His hand froze. The hair on his arms rose under his sleeves. He shut the radio off. The cab fell silent, so abruptly it was almost jarring. He sat there, listening, trying to decide whether he'd actually heard the words or just imagined them from the static. "Too many nights on the road," he told himself. "Mine's filling in the gaps." He started the engine, feeling the tremor of power rise through the cab. The dashboard lights strengthened. The heater pushed a faint gust of warm air against his knees. As he pulled out of the rest area, he checked his mirrors. The lot lay behind him, orange-lit and empty, with only that single rig sitting motionless at the far end. For a second, just a second, it looked like someone was standing beside the other truck, facing him. A tall shape, motionless, right at the edge of the light. He blinked, and the space was empty. Marcus focused on the ramp, merging smoothly back onto the highway. Once he'd settled into the right lane again, he glanced at the passenger seat and stopped breathing. There was a map lying there. He hadn't brought a paper map on this trip. He relied on the GPS and the routes he'd memorized through years of driving. The map was folded in that old roadside gas station style, creased and softened from being opened and closed many times. Its edges were slightly curled, like it had been handled by more than one person over many years. Snow slid across the windshield as he stared at it. The rhythmic drone of the tires on pavement seemed to recede, as though it belonged to someone else's truck, far away. Finally, he forced one hand off the wheel, reached over, and picked it up. It was a map of the state, his state. The highways spidery and blue, the veins of minor routes branching away in faint yellow. Tiny towns marked with dots and names. Rest areas, exits, and along the path of his current route, in thin red pen, a circle had been drawn that definitely hadn't come from any printing press. The circle looped around a place called Elmbrook. Marcus frowned. He traced the circle with his thumb. The town it wrapped around was printed in small, neat letters, as harmless and bland as any other rural name. He'd never heard of it. He glanced at the GPS mounted on his dash. The small glowing display showed his icon steadily crawling along Interstate 41, surrounded by the major towns he knew by heart. He zoomed in, panning along his planned route. No Elmbrook. He checked the nearest exits listed on the GPS. Numbers, towns, distances, all familiar, all accounted for. There was no Elmbrook between where he was and the state line, on any screen at least. The CB was still off. The cab hummed with nothing but mechanical noise and the faint whisper of air in the vents. Marcus looked back down at the map's thin red circle. Someone had gone out of their way to mark that town. The ink line was firm, not shaky or hesitant. Intention in every curve. He folded the map, slipped it into the narrow storage pocket by his seat, and told himself he'd throw it out at the next stop. Outside, the snow thickened. The night deepened into that strange, heavy kind of dark that only shows up in wide, empty places. The sparse lights of the few other vehicles on the highway appeared and disappeared like wandering fireflies, distant and unreal. Another 90 minutes passed. The monotony of the drive pulled at his thoughts, stretched them, let them fold back in on themselves. He found himself thinking about stories he'd heard over the years, a kind of unofficial folklore among drivers. There was the stretch of highway where everyone's radios went to static at the same mile marker. The gas station that always smelled faintly of wet earth, even in summer. The rest stop where dogs refused to leave their owners' vehicles. And there was something an older driver had mentioned once, offhandedly, while they'd shared a counter breakfast at a dawn-lit diner, a place he'd told Marcus quietly never to look for. Some towns, the older man had said, his eyes locked on the steam rising from his coffee mug, don't show up on the GPS anymore, but they're still out there. He'd smiled, a small, humorless curve of his mouth. It's better to let them stay out there. Marcus hadn't asked for details. Back then, it had sounded like another driver's superstition, nothing more. A sign loomed out of the dark, reflecting bright in his headlights. Exit 119, Elmbrook, 2 miles. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. The letters were white and perfectly ordinary, the green background the same shade as every other sign on the interstate. But his GPS didn't list an exit 119 for Elmbrook. According to his screen, exit 119 connected to a different state route entirely, leading to a different town. He checked the screen again. Exit 119, State Route 7, Janssen, distance 2 miles. He looked up at the sign retreating into the dark behind him, clearly printed with a different name. He drove on. Maybe it was a maintenance error, he told himself. A misprint. Someone swapped the wrong panel onto the frame. It happened. People weren't perfect. Next service is 47 miles, he remembered. There was no mention of Elmbrook on the blue boards. No gas logos. No promises of food or motels. Up ahead, another sign rose from the shoulder, half veiled by swirling snow. Exit 119, Elmbrook, 1 mile. His GPS still disagreed. Recalculating, the digital voice said, as if in response to something he hadn't done. The route line on the tiny screen flickered, redrew itself, and then settled exactly where it had been before. Exit 119 remained labeled Janssen. The road curved gently. The reflective posts along the shoulder ticked by. He watched them, counting, feeling an odd pressure building in his chest, as if the air had become a little thicker. When the exit finally appeared, it did so with a strangely sudden clarity, like a scene flicking into focus on a screen. To the right, a ramp peeled off the interstate, its white lines crisp in the snow, its slope vanishing down into blackness. The overhead sign glowed in his headlights. Exit 119, Elmbrook. No mention of any route number, no mention of services. Marcus stayed in his lane. The wheel felt heavier under his hands. The truck had no reason to drift, but he could feel a subtle pull, like driving along the edge of a deep, unseen ditch. The exit seemed to cling to the corner of his vision no matter how straight he kept his gaze. As he passed the gore point where the lane split, his headlights briefly illuminated the beginning of the ramp. For an instant, it looked older than the rest of the road, cracked, patched, the paint faint. Then it disappeared past his side window, swallowed by the dark. The strange pressure in his chest eased. The GPS chimed softly. Continue on current route, the flat digital voice advised, as if reassuring him he'd made the correct choice. He let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Another half hour crawled by. The snow lightened, turning from a curtain to a sparse scatter of flakes. The sky opened a little, revealing a few distant stars like pinpricks in cloth. His eyes felt sandy. He reached for the thermos, took a long drink of lukewarm coffee, and blinked hard to clear his vision. He checked a passing sign. Mile 108. A few minutes later, another. Mile 109. He glanced at the digital clock on the dash. The numbers glowed a soft, unhealthy green. He'd been on the road longer than he'd planned. The rest area had taken more time out of his schedule than he'd realized. He did the math automatically. If he kept this pace, he'd still make the hub by mid-morning. Barely. No more breaks. No more strange little stops at tiny, nearly empty rest areas. Another sign appeared, easing into the light. Mile 108. Marcus frowned. That wasn't right. He could have misread the previous one, but the numbers weren't small. There were no tricks of perspective with markers that big. 10 minutes later, there it was again. Mile 109. He rubbed his eyes, checked the odometer. He had definitely traveled more than a mile. More than 2. The numbers insisted on moving forward. The world outside seemed less cooperative. The road looked the same. The distant tree line, the faint rise and fall of terrain. It all fit perfectly with what he'd expect for this stretch of interstate. Familiar, unremarkable. Except he was somehow driving over the same 2 miles again and again. The CB, though still off, let out a faint crackle. A sound slipped through as if something had found a way past the power switch. Don't miss it this time. The voice was the same low murmur he'd heard before, close and oddly flat. without any of the usual radio distortion. A cold prickle threaded down his spine. He reached out, unplugged the CB unit completely, and set the coiled mic cable aside. The static cut off mid-fizz. The cab settled back into mechanical noise and soft, claustrophobic silence. The next sign loomed ahead. Exit 119. Elmbrook, 2 miles. There was no way that was possible. He had passed that exit long ago. He had stayed on the interstate, followed it straight, no turns, no mistakes. The GPS chimed again. Recalculating route, it said. The display flickered. The blue route line shifted, curved, and then for a moment split. One faint line continued straight. The other, thinner, peeled off to the right, toward a blank green area with no labels at all. Then both lines winked out. Signal lost, the unit intoned. The screen went gray. Marcus's fingers whitened on the steering wheel. The snow had stopped. The road was dry, the sky clear. There was no reason for satellite signal loss out here. No high canyons or tunnels, nothing to block. Ahead, in the dark, lights moved. At first, he thought they were oncoming headlights on the other side of the divided highway. Then he realized they were on his side arcs of pale white easing down an unseen ramp. A semi merged onto the interstate from the right, its trailer long and boxy, its cab an older model with rounded edges. No company logo, no identifying marks. It settled into the right lane a good distance ahead of him, moving just a touch slower than his own steady speed. Something about it bothered him. He couldn't place what at first. Then, as he slowly gained on it, he understood. The back of the trailer was wrong. The reflective strips along its edges were there, catching his headlights in sharp glints. But there was no license plate, no company name, no latch or handle. The doors were simply featureless metal, too smooth, like a model someone hadn't finished. As he got close enough to see the cab's side mirror, another detail clicked. There was no driver silhouette behind the windshield. From this angle, he should have seen a shape, shoulders, head, the blur of movement as hands worked the wheel. Instead, the space behind the glass looked dim, empty. The truck held dead steady in its lane. No drift, no correction, just mechanical perfection. Marcus eased off the throttle. He let his own speed drop until he held steady at a distance behind the other rig. Instinct screamed not to pull alongside it, not to put himself in that parallel place on the road. The CB mic, lying lifeless on its hook, vibrated slightly against the dash. Another sign approached. Exit 119, Elmbrook, 1 mile. The unmarked truck flicked on its turn signal. The blink was slow and deliberate, amber light pulsing against the dark. It moved into the exit lane. For a fragile moment, Marcus thought he saw someone in the driver's seat after all. A pale flash of a face, features blurred, turned forward, never once glancing at him. Then the illusion broke. The rig drifted down the ramp, its taillights shrinking, and was gone. The exit ramp remained. The sign waited. Exit 119, Elmbrook. His GPS screen stayed gray and empty. The wheel pressed back against his grip. It wasn't physical pressure, not really. The alignment was fine. The road was smooth. Yet there was a suggestion, a temptation in the curve of the asphalt to the right, as if his muscles were being quietly encouraged to follow the path that had hooked so many others. For one long second, he pictured it. He pictured letting the wheel turn just a little, taking the exit, following that unmarked truck down into the dark. Maybe a town would appear. Maybe lights would bloom along a small main street. A gas station with a bell that rang when you pulled up. A diner, glowing under fluorescent tubes, with a few late-night locals hunched over their pie and coffee. He pictured parking, stepping down, stretching his legs, hearing the crunch of gravel under his boots. And then, what? The image dissolved. A hollow feeling spread in his chest. His fingers hurt. He realized he was squeezing the wheel hard enough to make the tendons stand out under his skin. "No," he said aloud, voice flat in the cab. "No exits." He kept the truck aimed dead center in his lane and roared past the fork. For just an instant, as he passed under the sign, he thought he saw different words printed there. Not Elmbrook, but something else. "Welcome back, Marcus." He didn't look up a second time. The air in the cab seemed to thicken. A faint hum buzzed at the edge of his hearing. as if distant power lines crisscrossed the sky just out of sight. Then, abruptly, everything went dark. Not outside. The world beyond the windshield remained visible in the headlights. But the cab's lights dashboard, overhead, every indicator winked out in a single synchronized blink. The engine still thundered, the truck still moved, but he was suddenly a shape in a barely lit bubble, surrounded by shadow. The sensation of movement became surreal. It was as though he were floating, the road a ribbon under him with no real grip. Reflexively, his foot eased up, and he began bringing the rig to a controlled stop. Hazard lights. He needed his hazard lights. His fingers found the switch, clicked it. Nothing happened. No rhythmic orange flash on the road. No satisfying tick-tick in the dash. He barely felt the rumble strip under his tires as he guided the truck onto the shoulder, trusting muscle memory more than sight. The wide beam from his headlights caught the reflective posts close up as he eased the rig to a halt. The moment the truck stopped, the engine cut out on its own. Silence slammed into the cab. It was a thick, almost physical quiet, like someone had taken a blanket and thrown it over the world. Even the distant hiss of passing wind died away. Marcus sat, motionless, hands locked on the wheel, breath the only sound left. The darkness pressed in. He could see nothing beyond the weak cone of his headlights, and even that seemed to dim as he watched, like a flashlight's beam running low. Shadows drew closer, soft and formless, as if they were made not of absence but of intent. Something tapped the side of the sleeper compartment behind him. It was a small, polite sound, no louder than a knuckle lightly brushed against a door, 3 times, evenly spaced. Knock, knock, knock. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to look, to prove that it was just the truck's frame cooling in the cold air, or a branch knocked loose by the wind, or anything ordinary. He stayed facing forward. Outside, the highway was gone. Where the lane markings and guardrails should have been, there was only a kind of soft, gray emptiness. Not fog, not exactly. More like a blank space where distance usually lived. Staring into it made his eyes ache, like trying to focus on smoke. The tap came again. Closer this time. Nearer to his right shoulder, as if someone were knocking from just outside the passenger door. Knock, knock. A whisper slid into his ear, right through the fabric of the world. Missed it again. The voice had no accent he could pin down. No obvious gender. It was simply there. As if it had been riding with him for a very long time. Waiting for the right moment to be heard. Marcus closed his eyes. He remembered the older driver at the diner. The quiet warning. Some towns don't show up on the GPS anymore. Don't stop. Not for exits that aren't on the map, the man had added, almost as an afterthought. And if the road ever decides it doesn't want to let you go straight, you park. You turn everything off. You wait for daylight. He hadn't understood the weight of those words then. He did now. His hand fumbled for the key, turned it all the way to off, even though the engine had already died. He flipped every remaining switch on the dash to 0. Lights, radio, climate controls one by one. He shut them down, until the cab was entirely lifeless. The darkness welcomed him, cool and absolute. The knocking stopped. In the stillness that followed, time loosened its grip. It stopped behaving the way time was supposed to behave. Seconds stretched, minutes folded. His breaths came slow and measured, each one a tiny anchor to something solid. He thought of the unmarked truck taking that exit, of whatever had been waiting at the bottom of the ramp for the drivers who did. He thought of the map in his side pocket, the red circle around Elmbrook. He kept his eyes forward and his hands on the wheel. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, a faint light began to seep into the edges of the world. Not from any fixture, not from the headlights, but from the horizon itself. A thin grayness, like dawn testing the air. The dashboard lights flickered back to life on their own. The clock read 7:13 a.m. The engine coughed, then roared, startling him. The familiar vibrations filled the cab, grounding him back in the everyday physics of his truck. He let out a long, ragged breath he hadn't known he was holding. Outside, the highway had returned. Cars moved past in the early morning light sedans with commuters, box trucks, another long-haul rig with a recognizable company logo. The world looked perfectly ordinary, under a low, overcast sky stained faintly pink by the rising Sunday. The GPS chirped, its screen blooming with color again. Signal restored, it said. Continue on current route. There was no exit 119 anywhere near his icon. According to the display, he was at mile 137. The odometer agreed. He pulled carefully back onto the interstate, merged with traffic, and drove. At the next truck stop, he pulled in without even planning to. The need for a real human voice, for fluorescent lights that stayed still, and shelves of snacks that didn't rearrange themselves, felt sudden and overwhelming. Inside, the place smelled of coffee, frying oil, and warm rubber mats. The hum of conversation and television chatter wrapped around him like a blanket. He ordered a coffee at the counter. The woman behind it was middle-aged, with tired eyes and a name tag that said, Lorraine. She poured the coffee, slid it to him and paused, giving him a considering look. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said lightly, though there was something searching in her tone. "Long night," Marcus replied. His voice sounded thin, distant, even to his own ears. "Where from?" He told her the distribution center's name, mentioned the route. Tried to make it all sound as unremarkable as it should have been. "You come past exit 119? She asked too casually. He hesitated. The steam from his coffee fogged his glasses. "There was an exit 119, he said. Sign said Elmbrook. Lorraine's eyes changed. The surface friendliness slipped, replaced by something more guarded. "You didn't take it," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." She nodded once, reached under the counter, and pulled out something flat and old, protected in a cloudy plastic sleeve. She set it down between them. It was a faded photograph of a highway sign. Exit 14, Elmbrook, next right. The corners were rounded with wear. The image was sun-bleached, the colors washed out to pale ghosts of themselves. "That sign hasn't stood in 20 years, she said. "They tore down that whole interchange after the pileup in the 80s. Black ice, bad visibility. They say half a dozen trucks went off at once. Never should have been that many on that ramp at the same time. Herr Chazem at his. They also say some of the drivers never really left the road." He thought of the unmarked truck, the faceless space behind its windshield. "Highways remember things," Lorraine went on quietly. "We put up new signs, map them with satellites, draw pretty blue lines on screens. But the old paths are still there, underneath. Every now and then, they bleed through." She slipped the photograph back into its sleeve. "If you ever see the name of a town your GPS doesn't recognize," she said, "you keep driving. And if the road makes it hard to keep going straight, you do what you did. You stop. You wait for the Sunday. They don't like daylight much, whatever they are." Marcus didn't ask who they were. On his way back out to his truck, he checked the passenger seat. The map was gone. The storage pocket by his leg was empty. For the rest of his career, Marcus Hale never drove that stretch of interstate at night again. He told himself it was because of the weather, or because he'd found a slightly shorter route. But every time he passed the area in daylight, he watched the mile markers very closely. And never, not once, did he see a sign for Elmbrook again. Story number 2. By the time Irene Larkin rolled out of the valley and pointed her rig toward the mountains, the sky had already gone from gray to the color of old slate. It wasn't quite night yet, but the light had that tired, washed-out look that meant darkness would fall fast. Her trailer was loaded with paper rolls heavy, dense cylinders strapped tight and braced with timber. Legal weight, right there on the manifest. 79,540 pounds. She had checked it twice. The number sat in the back of her mind, the way the hum of the engine sat in the cab. Constant. Reassuring. Something solid in a world that could shift on a driver without warning. Her route, on paper, was plain. Up through the foothills, over the ridgeline by way of the main interstate, down the far side to the printing plant, 2 states over. She knew the run well enough to picture every rest area and every stubborn incline. She knew which way station usually sat open and which ones were almost always dark. She also knew there was a storm pushing in from the west. The dispatcher had shrugged when she'd mentioned it, leaning back in his squeaky chair under the buzzing office lights. "They're saying mostly rain, maybe some fog," he'd said. "You'll be over the top before it gets bad. Easy drop." Irene had been driving long enough to know that easy was a word you never trusted on a mountain night. But the load paid well. The plant needed their paper in the morning, and she liked the idea of being home before lunch the next day, with an empty trailer, and a quiet afternoon. So she'd hooked up, done her checks, and headed out, the day draining away behind her in the side mirrors. By the time she reached the first real incline, rain had started in earnest. It wasn't a gentle shower either. It came in sudden, heavy sheets that smacked the windshield and turned the world ahead into a moving watercolor of brake lights and tail lamps. Her wipers beat out a relentless rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. The heater hummed, blowing lukewarm air against the bottom of the glass to keep it from fogging. Traffic thinned as the road climbed. Passenger cars hugged the left lane, hurrying to get up and over before the weather worsened. Irene settled her speed, found that sweet spot between the engine's pull and the drag of the grade, and kept her rig steady. She liked this part of the drive on clear days. The trees fell away on either side. The land dropped back in rolls and valleys. And for a few minutes, the whole world seemed to open. Tonight, the view was just bands of gray and the occasional suggestion of headlights snaking along above or below her on switchbacks. The radio played low, some late-night host telling a story about sports scores and highway closures. She listened with half an ear until a particular phrase cut through. Rock slide up near mile 230, both lanes affected. Dot crews on site, but traffic is being rerouted. Her eyes flicked to the GPS. The glowing path ahead showed her planned path, straight over the main pass, right past that mile marker. A moment later, her phone buzzed in its dash cradle. Dispatch. She tapped the hands-free button. Irene, the dispatcher's voice crackled into the cab. You hearing the updates? Rock slide on the main pass, she said. Yeah, I caught it. Okay, listen. State's routing all heavy vehicles off at 214 and sending you through the old mountain road. It'll spit you back out near the other side. Adds an hour. Maybe. She frowned. Old road still open? To commercial only, with escorts when it's bad. They've got troopers posted. Follow the signs. Just don't skip the pulls if you see a scale lit. They're watching axle weights up there. He hung up before she could answer. Irene stared at the wet streaks sliding down the windshield. The old road. She'd heard about it plenty, 2-lane sections, tighter curves, a couple of steep drops where guardrails had more rust than paint. Most companies preferred their drivers to stay on the interstate, but an accident that blocked all lanes could change official opinions quickly. She drove on, watching mile markers slip past in their reflective green. 210, 211, 212. At 213, the first orange message board appeared. Road closed ahead, all trucks. Exit 214, follow detour. A line of red taillights arced toward the shoulder lane as rigs began to peel off at the upcoming ramp. Irene joined them, her turn signal ticking softly in the rain. The detour ramp dropped down into darker trees. The pavement here looked older, patched in places, the lane narrower. She followed the guidance of orange cones and portable signs that pointed her onto the old highway, a road that once had been the main route before the interstate had carved a cleaner line through the mountains. The rain eased for a few minutes, drifting into a mist that hung low over the asphalt. Her headlights bounced back off it in a pale halo. The world beyond that faint circle of light felt strangely distant, like a dream she couldn't quite wake from. The grade increased. The engine growled. Her speed bled down as the truck shouldered its way uphill. No other vehicles sat close in front of her now. The line of detoured trucks had stretched out along the winding road, each one wrapped in its own little cocoon of light and sound. In her mirrors, she could see the faint glow of another rig a good quarter-mile back, its beams hazy through the mist. Her GPS, confused by the reroute, showed her drifting off the neat, colored line into gray, unmapped space. The screen flickered, then recalculated, then gave up and left her icon floating on a nameless route. She drove by feel and by signs. At mile 170 on this older road marked by an aging metal post someone had repainted by hand, she saw it. The outline of a way station tucked into the slope on the right, just before a bend. A long, low building of concrete and glass. A scale house with its overhang reaching out over the lane like a brimmed hat. The place had the slumped, forgotten look of something that hadn't seen real use in years. Weeds grew along the edges of the lot. One of the big overhead lights had a dark, jagged hole in it where a rock or a branch had punched through. And yet, as she came closer, a green sign glowed to life above the lane. Open. The word shone steady and undeniable in the murk. Irene blinked, then checked instinctively for other cues. The pole sign before the station, the one that should have said, "Way station closed" or "Open," had its lower half blocked by a dripping pine branch. But there, under the sway of needles, she saw the faint reflection of the word "On." Maybe, she thought, they'd reopened it just for the detour. It made a certain sort of sense. Heavy trucks on an older mountain route, authorities would want to make sure no one was running too hot for the grades. A smaller lit sign ahead of the way station structure read, "All trucks, stop on scale, follow instructions." She signaled and moved into the right lane, tires hissing on the wet pavement. Up close, the building looked even more tired. The glass of the office windows was streaked and fogged, with a film of grime that caught her headlights. The benches near the door sagged a little in the middle, but inside, behind that streaked glass, she saw lights. A few overhead fluorescents glowed a pale yellow. A monitor screen cast a faint blue rectangle onto the ceiling. Someone stepped into view behind the window. They wore a reflective vest over dark clothing, the bands of tape glaring white in her beams. A cap's brim shadowed their face, hiding every feature. She couldn't make out their eyes, their mouth, anything at all. They could have been anyone. They raised a hand and motioned her forward. Irene rolled onto the scale pad. She watched the digital display mounted on a post beside the window, waiting for the familiar flicker of numbers as her axles settled. Nothing happened. The display stayed blank gray for a moment. Then, slowly, red numbers buzzed to life. Ling 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 ling. She stared. The digits began to climb. Iwan Lansen, Sanwen Wutsen, Lu Wen. They overshot her known weight without slowing. The numbers rolled up into the 90s, then stopped at 99999 and froze there. An impossible, pulsing lie. The smaller screen under it flashed a message in square, red letters. Over gross. Pull around back. Inside the scale house, the figure in the vest pointed sharply toward the side of the building, indicating a lane that curved behind it and out of sight. Rain drummed a little harder on the cab's roof. Irene felt the small muscles between her shoulders tighten. She knew her weight. She had picked this load up at the mill herself, watched the forklift place each coil, checked the scale ticket, felt the familiar sluggishness of a fully legal but heavy trailer. You didn't mistake 40 tons of paper for 50. She leaned toward the window and cranked it down a couple of inches. Cold, damp air slapped her cheeks. She could hear the rumble of her idling engine more clearly, the faint hiss of brakes on the other lane, the tap of rain on metal. "Scales off," she called out toward the lit office. "Ticket says 79,540. The attendant didn't approach the glass, didn't move closer so she could see a face. Just kept that hand lifted, the reflective bands catching the light, and repeated the gesture. Around back. The little screen below the frozen numbers flashed again. Pull around back. Park. Bring paperwork inside. Irene's fingers tightened on the wheel. She had been doing this too long not to feel when something was off. Drivers joked that you could smell a bad situation through steel and diesel. Sometimes it was just a feeling, a quiet animal sense that something on the road wasn't right. She felt that now, rising like cold water in her chest. The scale house, behind its smeared glass, looked wrong. Not in any one obvious way, but in tiny, disjointed details. The angle of a filing cabinet, barely visible through an inner doorway, seemed off, like it leaned a little too much. The flicker of the overhead lights didn't quite match their hum. The monitor on the ceiling displayed a blue screen with white text, but the text never scrolled, never changed. On the wall behind the hidden figure, a clock hung crooked. Its hands had both fallen to the bottom of the face, stuck there in a forever 6:30. Her radio, which had been murmuring soft music, fizzled into static. Every hair on her arms rose under her long-sleeve shirt. A sound came through the speaker, then faint, buried under the hiss. A voice. Almost lost. All units, repeat, do not enter the old way station at mile 170. Facility is condemned. Power should be offline. Bypass and continue to the new station at 242. Say again, bypass the old. The transmission crackled, warped, slurred. Then the radio went silent. Irene stared at the speaker, then at the scale house. The attendant's hand was still up, but something had changed in the way the figure stood. It took her a second to realize what it was. The vest bands weren't catching the light the same way. A second ago, They had reflected in sharp, white lines. Now, as she watched, the glow dulled, like something was draining out of them. The rain sliding down the office glass seemed to move in slow motion, every drop elongated. She looked past, the building at the lane that wrapped behind it. It curved into shadow between the scale house and a low concrete retaining wall. The overhead light back there flickered, on off, as if something big passed beneath it again and again. On instinct, she glanced at her mirror. In its wet, slightly warped surface, she caught a glimpse of the back corner of the station, the part she couldn't see from her seat facing forward. There, in a rough row under the trees, she saw shapes. Tall rectangles with rounded tops. Trailers. Old, streaked with rust, their paint peeling. Some sat at odd angles, their landing gear half sunk into the muddy ground, as if they had been left there for years. No tractors, no cabs. Just the backs of trailers, their doors all facing away from the road. As she stared, thinking she must be misreading shadows and trunks and branches, she realized none of them had license plates. Her own truck hummed beneath her, alive and ready. Irene took her hand off the gear shift, set her jaw, and eased the clutch back out. The scale creaked under her, the sensation faint but clear through the floor of the cab. The digital display stayed locked on 99999. The smaller screen flashed its command again, more insistently. Pull around back. The attendant stepped closer to the window at last. The brim of the cap hid the upper half of the face. The glass and the rain distorted what little she could see. But the mouth, what should have been the mouth, was wrong. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw no features at all, just a smooth, pale blur where a chin ought to be. Her foot found the accelerator. She drove straight. The wheels rolled off the first scale pad. The truck lurched slightly as it transitioned back onto the regular pavement. The figure in the vest jabbed a hand forward, as if shouting something she couldn't hear through the closed window, through the thickening rain. For a moment, just a moment, the air felt thicker, as if she were pushing the truck through water instead of air. The engine strained, even though she hadn't shifted gears. The trailer seemed impossibly heavy, like it had suddenly doubled in mass. Then, as her front bumper reached the edge of the canopy, something gave. It felt like a rubber band snapping. Her headlights, which had been painting the building in damp, jaundiced color, swept abruptly out into open road. Trees blurred past. The station dropped away beside her, shrinking in the side window. She checked the mirror again. There was nothing there. No scale house, no overhang, no wade-choked parking. Just a sheer, rocky embankment cut into the side of the hill, slick with rain, and a narrow gravel strip where maybe, long ago, a pull-off had been. Her stomach flipped. For a second, vertigo threatened to pull her right off the seat. Behind her, a pair of headlights rounded the previous bend and slid into view, another truck pushing up the grade. Its beams illuminated the same embankment, the same wet rock. No sign of any structure at all. Her radio popped, crackled, then sprang back to life mid-song. The music sounded too bright, too cheerful for the moment. Irene forced herself to breathe. In, out. Her hands had gone clammy on the wheel. At mile 242, on the far side of the mountains, the new way station appeared. Its lines were cleaner, its lights brighter. Fresh stripes marked the pavement. A big, clear sign announced, "All CMV, open, please stop when directed." She debated, for half a second, just rolling past. But routine and habit won. She signaled, eased into the lane, and followed the arrowed boards toward the scale house. Inside this one, everything looked as she expected. Modern glass, clearly printed posters on the walls, a coffee cup on a tidy desk. The attendant, a woman with short hair and a weathered face, stepped to the window and gave her the kind of quick, neutral smile someone gives a stranger they see 20 times a day. The digital display flickered. 79520. Got your papers? The attendant's voice came through the speaker, thin but clear. Irene nodded, holding the manifest up against the side window. The woman glanced at it, and then at the big screen again. "You're good," she said. "Roll on when you're ready." Irene cleared the scale, pulled off into the parking area, and set the brake. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her thermos. Before she could unscrew the lid, there was a tap on her door. It was sharp but not unfriendly. She jumped anyway. A state trooper stood on the pavement below, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. His cruiser idled a few spaces away, lights off, decals shining wetly in the station's glow. She rolled the window down a few inches. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Mind if I ask you a quick question about the detour?" His voice was calm, professional, a regular conversation. Her heart rate didn't seem to agree. "Sure," she managed. "You come up 170? He asked. "Old route?" "Yeah." "They pushed us off the interstate around 214. He nodded, as if that fit with everything he'd heard. "Any problems on that stretch?" he asked. "Flooding, downed trees, anything like that?" Irene hesitated. She thought of weed-choked pavement that had vanished, of a glass-fronted building that had been there and then hadn't, of a vest that had dulled in the light and a mouth that hadn't looked quite right. "No," she said slowly. Road was narrow, foggy, but passable. He studied her face for a moment, his gaze steady but not invasive. Then he reached into the plastic folder under his arm and pulled out a laminated sheet. "Reason I ask," he said. "We've been getting some odd reports from drivers on that detour the last couple of days. People thinking they see open facilities that aren't there anymore. Old signage lit up, that sort of thing." He held up the sheet so she could see it. It was a photograph, a little faded from being copied too many times. It showed a way station almost identical to the one she thought she'd just visited. Long, low building, overhang, the same general layout. In the picture, it was brighter, cleaner, clearly taken decades earlier. Across the bottom corner, in printed text, were the words, "Old Mountain Way Facility, closed 1998, and in bold, "Do not enter, structurally unsafe." The place was shut down after a slide undercut part of the foundation, the trooper said. "They killed the power, took down the signs. These days all you'll see is a concrete pad and a bunch of rebar. But we still get folks swearing up and down they went through it. Some even say they talked to staff." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not here to tell anybody what they did or didn't see," he added. "Mountains do strange things with light. Fog can play tricks. Long nights in the seat don't help." He tapped the laminated photo with one finger. "Whatever's going on up there, best advice I can give is this. If you see a place that tells you to pull around back and something in your gut says not to, listen to your gut." He folded the sheet back into his folder. "Drive safe, ma'am." She watched him walk back to his cruiser. Rain spattered the door, the mirror, the side of the trailer. The station lights hummed. Another truck rolled slowly past on the scale pad, its numbers ticking up in steady, logical order. On the way down the far side of the mountain, the sky finally broke open. The rain turned to a fine mist, then stopped altogether. Stars watched from between torn clouds. As the miles slid under her tires, Irene kept thinking about those old trailers she thought she'd seen behind the vanished station, parked in crooked lines, unclaimed, unmarked. The way the air had pressed against her truck when she refused to turn. She checked her mirrors more than usual that night, and long after the drop was made and the rig was parked, whenever she glanced at a clock and saw both hands resting at the bottom, she felt again, just for an instant, the weight of her load trying to anchor her to a place that no longer existed. Story number 3. They told Daniel he was lucky to get a dedicated truck. Most new drivers at the company rotated through whatever tractor was free at the yard, a scratched-up fleet of white boxes with different numbers and the same tired smell. But when he showed up for his first week of solo runs, the yard manager handed him a key ring with a single brass tag and nodded toward the far edge of the lot. 317's yours, the manager said. "Keep her clean, keep the inspection straight, and she'll treat you right." The rig sat alone near the chain-link fence, under one of the older sodium lights. It wasn't new, exactly, but newer than some of the others' sleek cab, deep blue paint just starting to dull along the edges. The number 317 was stenciled in reflective white on the driver's door. Daniel walked around it with the same mix of nerves and pride he'd felt the first time he'd climbed into a truck at school. His. Not just for the night, not just a loner. His. As he did his pre-trip inspection, a shadow fell over the front bumper. He glanced up. An older driver stood there, coffee in hand, gray in his beard, and the lines around his eyes deepened by years of sun and sleepless nights. His name patch read, Lou. "That's Lyle's old truck," Lou said, nodding toward the cab. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans. "They said it's mine now." Lou's gaze drifted. Over the windshield, Up to the roof fairing, back to the door. "Yeah," he said, "guess it is." There was something in his tone that made Daniel pause. "Who's Lyle?" he asked. "Was," Lou corrected, then seemed to catch himself. "Good driver. Ran nights mostly. Same runs you're doing now, paper to the plant. Backhauls when he could get 'em. Liked his coffee burnt and his music old." He took a sip from his cup, eyes distant for a second. "He didn't make it down off Ridge Point 2 winters ago," Lou added. "Matter of fact. Storm iced the west grade. Brakes got away from him. They rebuilt the tractor here in the yard. Company doesn't waste a good frame." Daniel's fingers tightened on the inspection clipboard. "I thought they took a truck out of service after a wreck like that," he said. "Depends how bad it was," Lou replied, with a shrug that tried to be casual. "Body shop did their magic. Engine checked. She passes DOT. She's just steel and bolts when all's said and done." He turned to go, then hesitated. "You run that west grade," he said quietly. "You don't ride your brakes. You let the Jake do the work. And you watch that air pressure. Mountain doesn't care how new your CDL is." He walked away, boots crunching on the gravel, leaving Daniel alone with the blue tractor and the soft buzz of the yard lights. Daniel finished his walk-around, forced himself not to think about twisted guardrails or skid marks vanishing over edges. Trucks wrecked. Drivers got in trouble. That was the job. You learned the rules. You respected your weight and your speed, and you lived through it. He climbed into the cab. The interior smelled faintly of rubber, dust, and the ghost of old cigarettes. Not the harsh, fresh reek of someone still smoking, but a stale trace in the upholstery, in the seams of the fabric, like someone had once lived in this space, day in and day out. He adjusted the seat. Something creaked softly beneath him, like a spring settling. For a moment, when his weight shifted, it felt like someone else's had just lifted away. He shook it off. New seat, old seat, didn't matter. He checked the glove box. Registration, insurance, a few folded inspection sheets. In the back corner, under the edge of the plastic liner, his fingers brushed paper. He pulled it out. It was a small spiral notebook, the top cover worn thin at the edges. On the front, in thick black marker, someone had written Lyle and the truck number 317. Daniel flipped it open. The first few pages were packed with cramped handwriting. Dates, route numbers, fuel stops. Little notes in the margins. Good pie here. Road work, 189, 193. Watch left lane. Trooper likes to sit behind billboard. The last entry was dated 18 months ago. He traced the date with his thumb. The route code matched the one printed on his own dispatch. Yard to West Mill, over Ridge Point. Drop at the printing plant. There were no words after that final line. Just a half-finished note about stopping before the grade to check, and then nothing. The pen stroke ended halfway through a letter. A chill moved down his back, slow and deliberate. He closed the notebook and slid it back into the glove box. When he turned the key, the engine caught on the first try. The dash lights glowed to life, instruments sweeping through their checks. Everything looked normal. Oil pressure good. Air building, no warning lights. Daniel pulled out of the yard and into the night. The first run went smoothly at the start. Highway miles melted away under the tires, the white lines ticking by in an easy rhythm. He settled into the feel of the truck the way 317 pulled under load. The slight tug to the right he could correct for with 2 fingers on the wheel. The particular pitch of the engine at different speeds. He found himself almost enjoying it. The nervousness of the yard faded. The story about the wreck folded itself into the background noise of the road. By the time he reached the foothills, the sky had gone from black to a deep navy, stars washed out by a thin film of cloud. Patches of fog lay in the low places, glowing faintly in his headlights like breath on a mirror. He turned off the main interstate onto the route that would take him toward Ridge Point. A green sign flashed his way. West Grade Summit 30, 2 miles. He checked his air gauges by habit. Pressure's steady. No leaks. Brakes had felt fine the whole trip. Firm. Responsive. He thought briefly about Lou's warning, about riding the engine brake, and resolved to do every descent by the book. No shortcuts. No lazy habits. Halfway to the summit, the radio he'd left off crackled to life. The volume knob hadn't moved. The display stayed dark, but from the speaker, a wash of static poured into the cab. In it, as if from down a long, long hallway, a voice threaded through. 31 westbound. Light flurries on the top, but the grade's clear. Jakes are your friends tonight, boys. The words were distorted, stretched at the edges, like an old tape played too slow. Daniel's hand jumped to the radio and shut it off, even though it already should have been off. The noise died instantly. Faulty wiring, he muttered. Old rigs had quirks, shorts, ghost currents. Nothing supernatural about bad electronics. The summit came up sooner than he expected. The climb wasn't bad. 317 took the grade with steady determination, dropping a gear here and there, never faltering. At the top, a wide turnout spread along the right, a place for trucks to stop and check their brakes before heading down the long, winding west side. Signs screamed their warnings in reflective white. Steep, grade, next 8 miles, check brakes, use lower gear. Daniel pulled into the turnout and set the brake. It was part caution, part respect for the mountain, for the job, maybe for the driver whose name sat on the notebook in his glove box. He stepped out into the cold. The air smelled of pine and diesel and distant snow. The sky above the ridge was a dull, flat gray now, hinting at weather somewhere beyond his line of sight. He walked around the truck, pressing gloved fingers to each brake drum. They were warm, but not hot. Nothing smelled scorched. No smoke. No steam. He was halfway down the passenger side when he felt it. The faintest impression of movement on the catwalk between cab and trailer. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but the metal vibrated as if someone had just stepped up onto it. He froze. The night was very quiet. Only the ticking of cooling metal and a soft, distant wind in the trees. "Hello?" he said, then felt foolish immediately. It was a mountain turnout, not a gas station. No one lingered up here for fun. Silence answered. He finished his check, climbed back into the cab, and closed the door firmly. The seat felt different. It was subtle, like someone much heavier had just stood up quickly. The cushion rose under him with a tiny sigh, then settled. Heart thudding too fast, Daniel buckled up, flipped on his engine brake, and eased 317 toward the start of the descent. As the nose dropped and the road unspooled ahead of him in a long, curling ribbon, the truck seemed to stiffen around him. Every vibration felt magnified. Every gauge stood out sharper in the dash lights. He went down the grade the way they'd drilled at school. Low gear, Jake on medium, no unnecessary brake applications. The engine growled, holding him back, the truck steady and controlled. Around the second curve, the fog thickened. Wisps slid across the road, then bunched into knee-high bands that glowed white in the beams. Out of nowhere, the Jake brake clicked off. The sudden absence of its throaty rumble jolted him. The truck surged forward, just a little, picking up the slope. He hadn't touched the switch. His hand flew out, fingers landing on the toggle, flipping it back on. Nothing. The indicator light stayed dark. The engine brake remained silent. Speed crept up, 45, 48. He eased his foot onto the service brake, feeling the familiar resistance, then a strange, spongy give. The pedal sank farther than it should. Adrenaline blasted through him. He pumped the brakes once, twice. The pedal firmed slightly, but not enough. 52. The grade curved ahead, guardrail hugging a drop. He did not want to imagine. "Come on, come on," he muttered, eyes flicking to the air gauges, pressure dropping. Not fast, but enough. And then the Jake came on by itself. The truck shuddered as the engine brake grabbed hard, louder than before, loud enough that he felt it in his teeth. The transmission downshifted without his foot on the clutch, the RPM needle jumping up into a zone that should have meant trouble. Instead of grinding or choking, the truck simply obeyed. Speed bled off. 50, 45, 40. The pressure stabilized. The engine brake held him there, humming like a hand on his shoulder, neither weak nor panicked, just steady. Daniel's own hands trembled on the wheel. He glanced at the dash. The Jake switch still sat in the off position. He hadn't flipped it. He risked a look at the passenger seat. For a fraction of a second, in the reflection in the side window, He thought he saw someone sitting there. A shape. Shoulders. Head. A hint of a cap brim. The space seemed darker than it should have been, as if it were filled. He blinked hard. The seat was empty. The fog thinned as he wound his way down the rest of the grade. The engine, brake continued to work, pulses of deep vibration through the frame until he reached the bottom and the warning signs gave way to flat land. Then, as abruptly as it had engaged, it released. The hum died. The switch position matched reality again. When he tested the toggle with his finger, the indicator light clicked on and off like nothing had ever been wrong. He finished the run in a kind of quiet shock. Made his delivery. Backed perfectly into the plant's loading dock on the second try. Handed his papers to the receiving clerk and nodded through their small talk like someone half awake. On his break, he popped the hood and checked for obvious issues. Lines looked intact. Nothing leaked. Nothing was smoking. It was as if the scare on the grade had been a trick of his own mind. Except brakes rarely lied. On the return trip, the mountain lay behind him. The road rose and fell in gentler ways. The truck seemed perfectly ordinary again, until he parked back at the yard and killed the engine. As the cab settled, the radio came to life one last time, even with the key out. "Not this time," a man's voice whispered through a bed of static. Then the sound cut, sharp and final. The silence after felt heavier than it should have. Daniel sat there a long moment before climbing down. He spent the next few days on easier runs, short hops between warehouses, flat highways, no major grades. The strange incident on Ridge Point slid around in his mind, never fully leaving, never quite settling into a normal memory. He found excuses not to talk about it. When other drivers asked how the dedicated run was, he shrugged and said, "Fine, truck pulls good." Nothing more. Then, on a Thursday, dispatch tagged him again for the west route. He looked at the ticket twice. Same origin, same destination, same code Lyle had written in his notebook a year and a half earlier. At the bottom of the printout, a note in all caps: "Do not use old 19. Stay on bypass. Black ice warning on local." He signed for the load anyway. The sky that night was clear but cold. The stars hard points in a brittle black dome. The air had that edge to it that said ice could form on shadows, even if the pavement still looked dry. He rolled out. 50 miles from the ridge, the in-GPS beeped and rerouted itself. The little digital line that had been guiding him to the bypass flashed, flickered, and then redrew itself, pulling his path off the main road and onto a thinner gray line labeled 19. He frowned. Recalculating, the GPS announced in its flat female tone. Fastest route selected. His dispatch note said otherwise. He tapped the screen, canceling the route. Re-entered the destination. Confirmed. Avoid local roads. The unit thought for a moment, then drew the same path. Onto 19. Over the old road. The steering wheel felt oddly firm under his hands, like he was fighting a slight lean in the tires. The truck wasn't drifting yet, but it wanted to. He turned the GPS off entirely. The glow of its screen died. The cab felt a little darker. On the radio, he caught a snippet of conversation he didn't like. "Westbound on 19, watch that patch after mile 12. It's still taking folks." He snapped the volume down. Mile markers ticked past. The sign for the bypass entrance appeared in the distance, its arrow promising a wider, safer curve. As he drew closer, the truck's cruise control flicked off of its own accord. His foot returned to the pedal out of habit. The wheel tugged, just a hair, to the right, toward the unlit exit for Route 19. He gripped harder, kept his lane, kept his eyes on the big green sign for the bypass. The exit for 19 streaked by on his right, a dark gash in the guardrail. Its own sign knocked half-crooked, unreadable. The pressure in the wheel eased. He let out a slow breath he hadn't meant to hold. Something moved in the corner of his vision. On the far side of the cab, in the half-shadow near the sleeper curtain, a shape shifted. Like someone had just sat down heavily on the bunk, making the mattress dip and the curtain sway a fraction of an inch. He told himself it was a trick of the road and the motion of the truck. Nothing more. At the summit turnout, he stopped again. Even though the bypass would take him down a gentler slope than the old west grade, he wanted his brakes perfect. He climbed out. Frost had formed along the edges of the asphalt, glowing faintly in his headlights. His breath came in white puffs. The night seemed thicker somehow. The distant noise of the highway below was strangely absent. He walked around the rig, checking drums with the back of his hand. Cool. Solid. Fine. When he turned back toward the cab, his heart stuttered. Words had appeared on the inside of his windshield. They were faint, written as if by a fingertip on glass that had just begun to fog. The letters were uneven, slanted slightly, but legible. Not this way. He stood there, breath pluming, watching as the faint warmth from the defroster blurred the message, softening its edges, until it vanished completely. He climbed up slowly, palms slick despite the cold. Inside, the cab felt close. The smell of old cigarettes was a notch stronger, like someone had rummaged through the ashtray of memory and stirred up the scent. He rested his hand on the steering wheel. "Okay," he said quietly to no one in particular. "Okay. We're doing this my way. The safe way. Bypass only." The engine started on the first turn. The descent on the bypass was uneventful for the first few minutes. Gradual, well-banked curves. Good signage. He kept his speed conservative, Jake on low, eyes flicking from road to gauges and back. Then, mid-curve, the brake pedal went soft again. The sensation was instant and sickeningly familiar. His foot sank farther than it should have. Resistance faded. The truck felt heavier, less attached to the world. An icy film slid over his nerves. He checked the air gauges. Pressure waning. Not a runaway drop, but wrong. Wrong for this grade, this speed, these inputs. Ahead, a yellow sign flicked by. Runaway truck, ramp 1 mile. The arrow beneath pointed into the dark. He knew the ramp. He'd seen it on satellite view before taking the job. A long bed of deep gravel climbing back up the hill. Last resort for drivers who'd lost control. His hands clenched on the wheel. The old impulse was to fight it. Pump the brakes, try to coax more bite from them. Stay in the lane, ride it out. He could almost hear an echo of some instructor's voice from school, the words too neat for the reality of what he was feeling. Over that, under that, another impression pressed in. A sense of urgency that wasn't exactly his. Like someone in the cab without a voice was leaning forward, willing him to listen. The engine brake snapped on. He hadn't touched the switch. The truck lurched as the transmission downshifted hard. The RPM needle climbed into a zone that should have had him wincing, but the engine simply held, loud and strong. The wheel tugged left, not violently, but definitely, away from the center of the lane, toward the narrow gravel throat of the ramp ahead. Daniel swallowed. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I get it." He turned the wheel. The rig surged onto the runaway ramp, tires fighting the sudden drag of thick, loose stone. The steering went light under his hands as the gravel grabbed at the weight of the trailer, pulling it down through the surface layer into the deeper bed. He rode it out. The truck slowed. 30, 20, 10. The seatbelt pulled tight across his chest as momentum bled off in long, shuddering breaths. They stopped halfway up the ramp. Silence fell so fast it rang. His own breathing sounded too loud in the cab. His pulse thumped in his temples. The engine idled calmly. The dash lights glowed their ordinary, innocent colors. The air pressure needle hovered just above the red. He sat there for a full minute, feeling the slight lean of the cab as the load settled into the gravel. When he finally trusted his legs, he set the brake and stepped down. The night air felt colder here, as if the ramp existed in a pocket of different weather. A highway patrol cruiser pulled in a few minutes later, crunching up the gravel behind him. The trooper who climbed out was young, his face still smooth under the brim of his hat, but his eyes showed the kind of tired that came from seeing too many close calls. "You picked the right place to stop," the trooper said, after checking Daniel's paperwork and the gauges with him. "You'd lost another 10 pounds of air. You'd have been a sled." They walked the length of the rig together. Near the back axles, the trooper crouched, ran his flashlight along a line, and whistled softly. "See that?" he said. In the harsh white beam, Daniel saw a thin line of fluid along one of the brake hoses. Tiny bubbles clung there, shimmering faintly. "Slow leak," the trooper said. "Heat and grade'll do that. Could have been building for a while. Good thing you listened to your nerves and took the ramp. Some folks ride it out until they can't anymore." He straightened up and gave the blue cab an appraising look. "This old thing's seen some miles," he said. "I remember a wreck on the west side a couple years back." Truck looked a lot like this one. Same color even. Didn't make it to the ramp. He glanced at Daniel. You company drivers talk, right? You hear about that one? Daniel nodded slowly. I heard. The trooper patted the side of the truck with one gloved hand. Maybe she learned something, he said, half joking, half not. Get that line changed before you head back over anything steep. A tow came for him an hour later, winching the loaded rig carefully back down off the ramp and into a flat turnout to wait for the company's service truck. The mechanic who arrived was an old guy with grease permanently embedded in the lines of his fingers and a name badge that said Ernie. He replaced the faulty hose, bled the brakes, and did a quick once-over of the rest of the system, muttering to himself the whole time. As he packed his tools, he paused. You're the kid in 317 now, Ernie said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Daniel said. Lyle's truck, Ernie went on. He complained about a soft pedal the week before he trailed off, eyes flicking to the grade beyond. Shop cleared it, said everything checked out. Might have missed a hairline like that. He nodded toward the replaced hose. Nobody's perfect. He wiped his hands on a rag, then on his pants. Funny thing, he said. After the wreck, when we got what was left of the cab back here, I found his notebook in the glove box. Same one every driver keeps. Routes, notes, doodles, whatever. Last line he wrote, if brakes feel off, take the ramp. Pride's cheaper than a coffin. He forced a laugh, but it came out thin. I left the book in the truck, he added. Figured maybe the next guy could use the tips. Daniel thought of the spiral notebook under his glove box liner. Of the half-finished sentence. Yeah, he said quietly. Maybe he did. On the way back to the yard, 317 felt lighter. The wheel didn't tug. The radio stayed stubbornly, blessedly silent except when Daniel turned it on himself. The seat didn't creak like someone else was shifting their weight with his. At the fuel island, under the harsh white canopy lights, Daniel wiped down the windshield with a squeegee. As he dragged the rubber blade across the glass, his breath fogged a faint patch near the bottom corner. For a brief moment, letters bloomed there, as if revealed from underneath. Good. Then the heat from his hands smeared them away. From that night on, Daniel treated 317 with the kind of quiet respect usually reserved for old mentors. He watched his gauges. He never ignored a soft pedal, never coasted a grade in too high a gear, never told himself he could ride it out when a ramp or a turnout was available. Sometimes, on long, empty stretches of highway, he would feel the faintest sense of another presence in the cab, a calm watchfulness, nothing more. Like someone older and more experienced, had slid into the passenger seat, boots up on the dash, content to let the kid handle the wheel as long as he kept his head. And once in a while, when a bad idea flickered across his mind, taking a sketchy shortcut, pushing past his hours, ignoring the weird noise in the wheel hub, another noise would answer it. A soft click from the glove box. A brief, phantom whiff of cigarette smoke. A reminder, perhaps, that some lessons on the road came too late. 317 ran for several more years without incident. Other drivers borrowed it on occasion, when Daniel was on vacation or home on a reset. Most returned it with compliments about how solid it felt. A few mentioned, offhand, that the radio seemed to have a mind of its own. None of them took the Old West grade, and no one else ever saw words in the frost on the inside of the windshield. Story number 4. Rosa liked the long, empty stretches. Most drivers complained about them, the endless 2-lane ribbons across the high desert, the miles of nothing but scrub and sky, the way the horizon never seemed to get any closer. But Rosa found a strange peace in it. No tangled traffic, no sudden merges, no impatient commuters darting in and out of her blind spots. Just the hum of the engine, the soft hiss of tires on asphalt, and the slow, steady march of mile markers under her headlights. That night, the desert was a dark sea around her. The sky above was moonless, a deep black bowl pricked with a few indifferent stars. Her headlights carved out a cone of pale yellow that seemed very small compared to the sheer size of the emptiness. The last town was almost 100 miles behind her. The next real stop, according to her GPS and the dog-eared atlas tucked beside her seat, was still nearly 90 miles ahead. Fuel was fine. She'd checked it twice. The gauge hovered above half a tank, enough to get there with a margin. A green sign flashed by on the right. Next services, 96 miles. She rolled her shoulders, working out the stiffness. The dashboard clock read 1:27 a.m. Her logbook said she had enough hours left to push through, and then sleep a full day on the other side. The plan was simple. A gust of wind slammed into the side of the trailer. The rig shuddered. Rosa's hands tightened on the wheel automatically. High desert winds could come out of nowhere, tumbling down from invisible ridges to shove at anything that dared cross. The crosswind didn't let up. It settled into a steady, invisible push, as if some great hand had set itself against the side of the trailer and decided to lean. Her fuel gauge began to drop faster than it should have. At first it was only a subtle thing, barely a mark moving. Then, as the shoulder shrubs bent and the dust devils appeared in the edge of her headlights, she watched the needle slide more quickly toward the quarter mark. She did the rough math in her head. Headwind like this meant higher consumption. The fuel stop ahead might no longer be a comfortable certainty. Still fine, she told herself. Still got plenty. The CB crackled softly. She hadn't touched it in hours. The channel sat on a common one, volume low, background noise more than company. Now, through a wash of static, a male voice came through. Faint, but clear enough. Anybody know if Wayrest is open tonight? Another voice answered, somewhere between the hiss. Wayrest's always open. Rosa frowned. The names of most truck stops along her regular routes were burned into her memory, like an extra layer of map. She'd never heard of anything called Wayrest on this stretch. She glanced at the GPS. The empty gray ahead showed her next programmed stop. High Mesa Travel Center. 80. 2 miles away. No Wayrest. No anything. Probably some little independent, she muttered. One pump, one rusty sign. The wind worsened. Sand began to hiss across the pavement, small drifts building in the breakdown lane. Her world narrowed even more. Beyond the reach of the headlights, there was only darkness, and the suggestion of movement as low brush bowed under invisible forces. The fuel gauge dipped toward an uncomfortable place. 70 miles, 68. She watched the digital miles to empty readout. It ticked down with an eagerness that made her throat go dry. She tapped the gauge face with one finger, as if that might steady it. It didn't. At 62 miles to her planned stop, the miles to empty display flashed, hesitated, and jumped down to 50. That's not funny, she whispered. Another green sign loomed out of the dark. Gas, food, showers, 1 mile, Wayrest station. The metal looked older than the others along the highway, the paint slightly cracked, the font a style she associated with photographs from the 70s. But it was freshly reflective, the letters glowing stark white in her beams. Her GPS did not acknowledge it. The screen remained uninterested, insisting the next services were still 80 miles ahead. Rosa watched the sign slide past in her mirror, the arrow pointing down a barely visible side road that vanished into black. Stopping at unlisted places wasn't something she liked. Company safety meetings taught their own kind of nervousness. Unregistered fuel receipts, unsecured lots, the wrong kind of strangers. But the gauge had dropped below a quarter. The wind clawed at the side of the trailer, eating fuel with every mile. The idea of being stranded out here, waiting 3 or 4 hours for a service truck that might or might not find her without clear landmarks, sat like a cold stone in her stomach. Another sign appeared, this one smaller, closer to the shoulder. Wayrest Station. Last fuel before High Mesa. A narrow arrow pointed to an exit ramp that seemed to grow out of the desert more than out of the road, its pavement a slightly darker black than the main line. She flicked on her turn signal. The ramp dropped gently away, curving into a shallow basin hidden from the highway. As she descended, the wind eased. The roar in her ears quieted to a distant moan. The sand on the shoulder calmed. Lights rose ahead, not the glaring white of modern LEDs, but a softer, yellowish glow. A cluster of buildings emerged low-slung, with flat roofs and faded siding. A gas canopy with 4 diesel pumps, a small concrete block store with big front windows, a weather-beaten sign atop a rusted pole, Wayrest Station, gas food showers. The parking lot was larger than she'd expected. A dozen truck spaces stretched along the far side, separated from the pumps by a low curb. 3 of them were occupied. The trucks sitting there were strange. One was an older cabover, the kind she only saw in vintage photos or in the occasional nostalgic parade. Another was a long-nosed, conventional, painted in a color so sun-faded, it was hard to tell what it had originally been. The third, closest to the building, wore a company logo Rosa dimly recognized from childhood, a carrier that had gone under years ago. She pulled up to the diesel pump. The equipment itself looked clean. The card reader was old but not ancient. No cobwebs, no obvious neglect. The smell of fuel hung in the still air, familiar and grounding. Rosa stepped down onto cracked concrete. The night felt different here. The highway's distant rush was gone, as if someone had closed a door on it. The air was cool but not cold, carrying a faint scent of dust and old fryer oil. She slid her card. The reader beeped, thought about it, then flashed. Approved. Lift nozzle. She filled the tanks, watching the numbers climb on the mechanical counter. The price per gallon was lower than she'd seen anywhere in months. "That's not possible," she murmured. The pump clicked off. Inside the small store, bell above the door chimed as she entered. The sound was sweet and analog, not a recorded ding, as if an actual spring still moved a small brass tongue. The interior felt like a time capsule. Row of wooden booths along one wall. Checkerboard linoleum, scuffed but swept. A counter with a glass pie case. A scattering of paperback novels on a spinner rack, their covers faded, their titles in fonts she hadn't seen in a long time. A man stood behind the counter, wiping a mug with a towel. He wore a button-up shirt with pearl snaps and a name tag that simply said, Cal. "Long way from anywhere," he said by way of greeting. "Yeah," Rosa replied. "Didn't think there was anything out here." He smiled a little. "We're easy to miss, if you're not looking." She paid for the fuel. He rang it up on an old register that still punched numbers in red on paper tape. The receipt he offered her was handwritten, the carbon copy faint. "Coffee's fresh," he said, nodding toward a pair of glass pots on a warmer. The clock above them read 1:27, the same time her dash had shown what felt like an hour ago. Rosa poured a cup. Two truckers sat in one of the booths, their backs to her. One had a jacket with a trucking company patch she recognized from an old photo of her father, an outfit that had merged with three others long before she ever sat behind a wheel. The other wore a denim vest with a stitched-on name she couldn't quite make out. Their low conversation drifted over. "Dispatch keeps faxing the wrong town, I tell him. You can't send me up old 6 inches this weather. Radio said they're closing the canyon, but the sign was still green when I came through." Their words didn't match her world. Faxes. Old route numbers. She'd only seen in historical notes when highways got renumbered. She glanced at their faces as she walked by. They could have been any age between 30 and 50. Tired eyes. Coffee steam curling up between their hands. They didn't look strange, just out of time. A jukebox in the corner played quietly. The song was an old one, something about a lonesome highway and a woman back home. When it ended, there was a brief pause. Then the same song began again from the first note. Rosa checked her phone. No bars. The time on the locked screen read 1:27. She frowned. "That can't be right." Cal looked up from wiping the counter. "Clock's been stuck for years," he said lightly. "Nobody here pays it much mind." "On my phone too," she said. He only shrugged. Something prickled at the back of her neck. A feeling like standing at the top of a stairwell and not being sure how many steps there really were. On a corkboard near the restrooms, a row of paper notices fluttered slightly in the faint breath of the air conditioner. Rosa glanced at them absently, then stopped. The flyers were yellowed, curled at the corners. Some bore dates handwritten or printed, with years that made her chest tighten. 1,993. 1,987. 2001. Most were missing driver. Notices, photocopied pictures of men and women in ball caps and reflective vests, smiling in that awkward way people did when they weren't used to cameras. In the center of the board hung a photograph, tacked up with more care than the rest. It showed the front of Wayrest Station from what looked like decades earlier. The pump island was the same, but the signs were brighter, the paint unsullied. 5 trucks were parked out front. They spanned generations of design, some even older than the cab over outside. On the far edge of the photo, partly cut off, was the nose of a blue tractor with a white company logo. Rosa recognized made her brows knit. Her company, her carrier's current branding. Her gaze dropped to the handwritten caption under the photo. Some folks just keep coming back. Her mouth went dry. She stepped back, the worn linoleum cool through the soles of her boots. In the glass of the front windows, she caught her reflection, and beyond it, for a brief instant, more than just the pumps and the lot. Behind her truck, in the dim space near the edge of the property, stood a line of rigs, dozens of them. Some with old paint schemes she recognized from history, others bearing logos she'd never seen. They were parked too close together, nose to tail, as if someone had lined them up and forgotten them. Their headlights were off, their cabs were dark. But as she watched, a faint glow pulsed once behind one windshield, like a breath catching on glass, then died. She blinked. The lot outside returned to what it had been. 3 trucks, sleeping beneath sodium lamps, and hers at the pump. Cal leaned his elbows on the counter. "Road's long from here," he said conversationally. "Storm like this, a lot of folks choose to get some shut-eye before they go back up." Rosa realized abruptly that she could no longer hear the wind. The oppressive push that had eaten her fuel on the highway was gone. Outside, the bushes didn't move. "How long you been out here?" she asked. Cal smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Long enough to see drivers make good choices and bad ones," he said. "You can stay if you want. There's always room." The 2 men in the booth had gone silent. When she glanced over, they were looking at her not unkindly, not hungrily, just watching. Her coffee had gone lukewarm in her hand. She set the cup down carefully. "I should get back on the road," she said. "Delivery time's not going to move itself." Cal nodded once. "Suit yourself. Highway's just up the ramp. Once you're gone, you're gone." There was something in the way he said it that made her heart beat faster. Rosa walked out into the quiet. The air felt heavier now, as if it were full of unspoken decisions. As she climbed into the cab, she glanced at the dash clock. 1:27 a.m. She started the engine. It turned over smoothly, settling into a low, comforting rumble. The fuel gauge, topped off, glowed reassuringly near full. For a moment, she hesitated. The thought of a shower, a real bed even in a dated little sleeper room out back was tempting. No fighting the wind. No risk of running low again. In the mirror, the station windows shone softly. Figures moved inside. One of the parked trucks flickered its marker lights, just once, as if in greeting or farewell. It was hard to tell which. Rosa put the truck in gear. At the top of the ramp, as she merged back onto the highway, the wind hit her again. It slammed into the side of the trailer like a shoulder. The sand hissed along the shoulder. The feeling of motion returned with such force that she realized, with a shiver, how still the basin around Wayrest had been. She didn't look back. Mile markers resumed their steady march. The fuel gauge dropped, but at a normal, expected rate. The GPS, which had frozen earlier, blinked back to life with a soft chime. "Continue on current route," it said, as if she'd never left it. Half an hour later, she passed a weathered relic of a sign half buried in brush near the fence line. Her headlights brushed it just long enough to catch a few flaking letters. Rest. The rest was gone. At High Mesa Travel Center, under modern lights and surrounded by the hum of refrigerated trailers and idling engines, Rosa found a spot and shut down for the night. Inside, the bright convenience store smelled of new coffee and microwaved food. Televisions blared the day's news. Phones chirped. Life moved forward. On a whim, she asked the cashier, "You ever hear of a place called Wayrest Station out on 27? The woman behind the counter, a young clerk with a nose ring and a company polo, frowned in thought. "My granddad used to talk about a stop with that name," she said slowly. "Said the company he drove for went there all the time. But that was like before the big bypass. They closed it down after some incident. Before I was born." She shrugged. "There's nothing out there now. Just scrub and an old foundation. Why?" Rosa shook her head. "Just saw the name in an old magazine," she said. Later, in her bunk, as the truck ticked softly in the cooling night, she stared at the small digital clock built into the stereo. 1:28 a.m. Finally, the minute had turned. She let the soft rumble of distant highway noise lull her. But long after her eyes closed, part of her mind lingered on a basin in the desert that felt cut off from the wind and the passage of time. A place where the coffee never quite cooled, the clock never quite moved, and, "On the radio?" he asked. "We've been trying to get warning out to anybody eastbound, but this soup is playing games with the signal." I could barely raise dispatch. Malik swallowed. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, I heard something. On a weird channel. Didn't sound like you." The trooper frowned. "We're on 19. Regular. You on some kind of split rig?" "Apparently," Malik murmured, more to himself than to the officer. The trooper tapped the doorframe lightly. "Sit tight," he said. "As soon as they get a wrecker in position, we'll wave you through." He disappeared back into the mist as quickly as he'd appeared, his reflective strips melting into the fog. Malik leaned back in his seat, heart still thudding. The CB speaker hissed softly, a sound like distant surf on a rocky beach. He looked at the display. 19:15. He picked up the mic. "Chuck?" he said before he could talk himself out of it. "Ray? You still out there?" For a long moment, there was only noise. Then, faint as breath on a mirror, the male voice returned. "Who's that?" "Name's Malik," he said quietly. "Southbound tonight. I heard you talking about a tanker at 4 to 8. You were right. I stopped. I'm okay." The static shifted, rippled. "That so?" the voice said. There was something like relief in it. Good. Maybe it ain't just us then." "Us who?" Malik asked. The line crackled. "Folks who didn't get the message in time," the man said. "Years back, when the fog rolled in fast and the truck lights never made it through. We've been talking on this band a long time, trying to find anybody who can hear us. Most nights it's just our own echoes." His laugh was short, brittle. "Sometimes, though, we get through. Somebody slows down. Somebody lives. That's something." Malik's skin felt too tight. "How long ago?" he asked. "How long since your wreck?" Static washed over the answer, but he caught fragments. 2000 and... Winter. Pile up. More than a dozen. He reached for the notebook he kept by the dash and scribbled. Causeway. Fog. Multi-vehicle. Winter. The word Ray underlined twice. "Why me?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Why tonight? Fog's funny," the man said. "Bends more than light. Bends time if it wants. Sometimes midnight stretches wide enough that things slip." Malik stared at the numbers glowing soft green on his dash. 12:19 a.m. Behind the static, he heard another voice. A woman's this time. Breathless, but not scared now. Curious. "Who are you talking to, Chuck?" she asked, words faint. "Driver named Malik," Chuck replied. "Says he made it past 4 to 8. "That so?" she said. "Good. Maybe I won't have to see it again tonight." Her voice tugged at something in Malik's memory, though he couldn't say what. A tone he'd heard in other drivers at 3 in the morning, somewhere between exhaustion and stubbornness. The trooper's silhouette loomed suddenly in his mirror, arm waving him forward. Up ahead, the tanker had been shifted just enough to open a skinny lane between its nose and the guardrail. "I've got to move," Malik said into the mic. "They're letting us by. Thank you for the warning." A pause. Then, "Keep your band on, Malik," Chuck said. "Next time you're in the fog, we might need you to answer." The channel went dead. Malik rolled forward, easing past the wounded tanker. As he passed the cab, his headlights cut through the fog just long enough for him to see a shape behind the glass. A driver in a ball cap, talking to someone on his own CB, hand moving animatedly. For a heartbeat, it looked like the man's mouth was forming Malik's name. Then the angle changed. The fog folded back in. The image was gone. On the far side of the bottleneck, beyond the reach of the trooper's portable flares, the fog thinned. Bit by bit, the world returned guardrails, water reflections, the ghostly outline of distant shore lights. The radio's display blinked once. 19.5 flickered, then settled back to 19. Ordinary chatter slipped in almost immediately. "Yeah, they're closing the span behind us. Had some kind of mess up ahead. You boys hear about that old crash out here? Back before they put in the new barriers?" He drove in silence for a while, letting their words wash past without comment. At the next large truck stop, Malik parked, went inside, and found a quiet corner where the payphones used to be. The wall there now held vending machines and a dusty bulletin board with company notices. On his phone, he searched news archives for Causeway fog pileup tanker. It didn't take long. There it was, an article from nearly 20 years earlier. Dense fog, multi-vehicle accident on the span. Several trucks, including a fuel tanker. Dozens injured. A handful of drivers lost. A smaller follow-up piece listed names, among them Charles Chuck Hinton, Rachel Cortez, known to friends as Ray. He sat there a long time, the glow of the screen painting his face. On his next coastal run, weeks later, the night was clear. Stars sharp, air dry. No fog advisories on the signs. Still, when he reached the causeway, he turned his CB to 19 and listened. 40 miles in, with nothing but open water and moonlight around him, he keyed the mic once. "Any eastbound or westbound out here tonight?" he said, keeping his voice low, almost embarrassed. "This is Malik. Just checking in." Silence. Ordinary, empty, human silence. He smiled at himself, at the foolishness, at the strange comfort in even trying. As he went to hang the mic back on its hook, the speaker hissed softly, like someone clearing their throat in a faraway room. "We hear you, Malik," a familiar male voice said, thinner than ever, like it had traveled a very long way. "Keep it between the lines." Another voice chimed in, faint and wry. "And if you ever hear somebody on this band calling your name from a mile marker you don't like the sound of," Ray added, "promise us you'll listen." He swallowed past a suddenly tight throat. "I promise," he said. The static settled back into ordinary noise. The channel filled again with the endless, mundane talk of the road. But sometimes, when the fog rolled in fast and the causeway vanished into gray, Malik would hear other things in the gaps between words. In the thin hiss no one else seemed to notice. Warnings, names, pleas sent out across years. And he knew, with a steady certainty that surprised him, that somewhere on a frequency that didn't belong on his radio, there were drivers who had not made it home, doing their best to make sure that others still could.